Greetings, friends of liberty. Now, I think it goes without saying that most of you know of the Gallic rescue missions that I and my companions constantly undertake, making our way again and again into La Patrie to rescue les citoyens from their own countrymen, of course. Heading into France and out again, we've assembled quite a collection now of aristos in London. If we sold them all back to the Montagnards, no doubt we'd make a pretty penny indeed. But no, as I often say to Andrew, wherever shall we put them all? London will soon be full. Lock, stock, and barrel are poor pedestrians, suffering with good humour the rank odour of their garlic breath. And the ladies in their robe à la polonaise that uses 3 times as much fabric as your average English dress. Well, I suppose what's the harm if they still have the money for it? Now, when leaving France in my schooner Daydream, we leave the land of Le Pays de Molière and the sounds of Nos armes citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons. Thankfully, when we can finally leave these constant refrains in the distance, the sounds replaced by the welcome rustle of wind and sail and waves lapping upon the hull, we inquire of our charges where they would like to be set down, and, if convenient, we take them there straight away. Oddly enough, they increasingly mention not London, but the island of Guernsey. Well, at least it is our dependency. Just last time, we had a batch of 12, and all wanted to be set down in St. Peter Port, Guernsey's main harbour. And so we made way for the eastern approaches. As we approached the harbour by the village of St. Sampson, we saw some of the famous Guernsey cows, increasingly known throughout England for their yellow butter and rich milk. And as we entered the harbour and docked at an empty quay, we were soon met and welcomed by many other French emigres, the news of our arrival being spread far and wide. A happy ending indeed. Now, if we turn from instances of Frenchmen taking refuge on the island of Guernsey in the 18th century to those implementing the exact same idea throughout various portions of the 19th century as well, we meet today Guernsey's most famous refugee in exile, novelist, dramatist, politician, and poet Victor Hugo, who, like so many of those fleeing the revolution in my own 18th century, also fled persecution, this time of Napoleon III, escaping to Guernsey for 15 years. Our author and chronicler David Bellos, himself reputed to be a genius of translating, spent his publisher's pence giving us a huge amount of context into Hugo's life, and how it was that he came to write one of the most beloved novels of the last century and a half. Bellos begins by giving a brief outline of the political circumstances that led Hugo to flee as a refugee, and then quickly transitions into a brief synopsis of the novel itself. This synopsis helps those who haven't read the book and also functions as a refresher for those who have. Hugo divided the novel into 5 parts, each named after an important character. Part 1, Fantine, focuses on an abandoned single mother who loses her job and falls into prostitution, a brush with the law, and an early death. Part 2, Cassette, foregrounds Fantine's daughter, who is cruelly exploited by foster parents and then rescued by the novel's hero, who brings her up to become a young lady. Part 3, Marius, features a middle-class student who joins a group of political idealists and fights with them in a failed attempt to overthrow the monarchy. Part 4 alternates between the love affair of Cosette and Marius and the student's barricade in the heart of old Paris. And Part 5 is entitled Jean Valjean, after the ex-convict
whose life story from the age of 45 to his death 20 years later is the narrative backbone of the novel. Bellos comments that as a life story novel, Les Miserables is a characteristic work of its time, similar to Madame Bovary, Great Expectations, and Crime and Punishment. Jean Valjean is not a complicated, mixed, self-critical, or tragic hero, but a model of a new man. What he models is the potential that the poorest and most wretched have to become worthy citizens. After giving us a more in-depth recounting of the story and a brief bio of Hugo, Bellos then describes how some of the elements of the plot coalesced in Hugo's mind over a period of years. The first was when he himself was walking in Paris and witnessed a man stuffing a handful of snow down a young woman's dress. When she, outraged, attacked him, the police were called and she was arrested. Hugo, however, went along to the police station, told them what actually happened, and thus secured her release, for which, understandably, the woman proved enormously grateful. Hugo, as Jean Valjean, do almost the exact same thing he did. A second incident, later introduced from real life, was of a convict using great strength distributed to his heels and elbows at the angle of a wall to inch himself upwards to escape from prison. A third example was of a convict jumping from the tall mast of a ship, then being presumed drowned when he actually survived. Hugo started the rough draft of the novel, which he called Les Misères, or The Miseries, in Paris in November of 1845. Ironically, about 2.5 years later, just as Hugo, about one half done, reached a point where his characters are fighting on the barricades, an actual revolution with honest-to-goodness barricades appeared in Paris itself. This was, of course, one of the many revolutions of 1848. In France, it was called the February Revolution and inspired all the rest. In Italy, Poland, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Holland, and Denmark. Afterwards in France, universal male suffrage was granted, governmental workshops were created, and slavery was abolished in all French colonies. But the government soon disbanded these workshops, introduced compulsory conscription for able-bodied unemployed men under the age of 25, and banished all other jobless men to the provinces so as to get them off the city's streets. This caused massive unrest, and mobs soon took to the streets. Hugo, being a peer of the realm, felt obliged to maintain order, and so apparently for more than a day directed the fire of governmental troops onto the barricaded mobs over and over again. All this was such a shockingly profound experience for Hugo that soon after, in June 1848, he stopped writing Les Mis, and being elected to Parliament increasingly became involved in debating the country's political future. And when the president, Napoleon III, threatened to act unconstitutionally by staying in power for 2 consecutive terms, Hugo remarked in the chamber, "Because we had Napoleon le Grand, do we have to have Napoleon le Petit?" This cutting witticism earned him the undying enmity of Le Petit, who, once he had completed his coup d'etat and become emperor, ordered Hugo's arrest. Hugo first went underground, and then, staying a step ahead of the dictator, to Brussels, living there for 8 months. Then in 1852, he went to the Channel Island of Jersey. However, being kicked out because he took the side of some French emigres who had asked Queen Victoria after a visit by Napoleon III to not reciprocate the favor by visiting him back in Paris, he was asked to leave. And so in 1855, he traveled north 25 miles to settle in Guernsey. Bellos here intersperses various sociological remarks about Hugo, France, and Les Mis. He says, for example, that A, despite Victor Hugo being a compulsive philanderer, once caught by the police in flagrante delicto, and despite French novels of the time overwhelmingly discussing adultery, there is not a breath of either adultery or sex in Les Mis, and many of its characters are celibate. B, there are hardly any horses in Les Mis, this allegedly indicating the poverty of the general cast of characters. C, Jean Valjean hardly says a word in the novel, being one of the most laconic central characters ever created. Partly, Bellos argues, because his lower-class accent would have given him away. But his relative laconicity shifts the focus of the novel from what he might say to the morality of his actions. D, the popular novel The Count of Monte Cristo, written in 1846, like Les Mis, begins with false imprisonment and then escape. However, the two authors treat the same theme very differently, one being revenge, the other redemption. E, Hugo never liked going into debt, and none of his good characters do this. F, in the 19th century, many new, very vivid dyes were invented, and this was how Jean Valjean's factory, which used a new dye of very dark jet black, became profitable. G, Hugo, to a degree, as many people did then, engaged in various forms of spirit calling, such as table rapping or seances, to communicate with their deceased loved ones. Hugo's first daughter, Leopoldine, had died at 19 in a freak boating accident on the Seine, and he tried to communicate with her spirit. H, Hugo's father, General Leopold Sigisbert Hugo, was an heroic individual and the last French soldier to surrender before the Peace of Vienna began in 1815. He gave to his son the determination to do your duty and never give in. Hugo gives his hero, Marius, some of these qualities. I, Hugo, while believing in God, didn't affiliate with any specific religion. However, his son Charles, an atheist, complained that his father made the Catholic priest Myriel heroic, since in the story Myriel forgave Jean Valjean's theft of his silver and, when the gendarmes brought him back, even gave him 2 candlesticks, silver as well. Now, since Hugo's daughter Adele often kept a verbatim diary, Bellos gives us the nearly exact conversation that Hugo had with his son about this critical narrative incident. In Hugo's own words, as he replied to his son, "You call Myriel a Catholic priest? I would say that the portrait of a pure, great, and real priest in my book is the most savage satire imaginable of real living priests today." This conversation occurred just as Hugo started work again on finishing the novel. But first, in May 1860, he reviewed the entire script, now close to 1,000 pages, and made a list of 18 issues that needed addressing. By December, he was ready to start writing again. In all this, he was much helped by his lover, Juliette Drouet, who had long before abandoned her career as an actress to be her great man's copyist. Thankfully, Drouet lived right next door to the Hugos, Victor's wife tolerating this arrangement because she had essentially sworn off of sex after 8 years of marriage and 5 children, tiring of Hugo's insatiable sexual appetites, which Juliet helped slake right next door. Some of the many aspects and difficulties of the final stretch of writing, which Bellos details, were: A, Hugo inserted many additional essays into earlier parts of the script, such as, famously, his thoughts on the Battle of Waterloo, which covered 19 chapters and which hadn't even been written when he submitted the manuscript for publication. B, as the book neared completion in May of 1861, Hugo and Juliet went to live in a hotel in Waterloo, where he wrote every day, taking walks around the battleground to exercise and let his subconscious become fully immersed in the historical context. C, after Hugo had finished the rough draft on June 30th, 1861, at 8:30 a.m., joyously writing to some friends, announcing it, he had one final task at hand, a final read-through and polishing to give the text the patina of perfection. But before he did this, to recharge his intellectual and artistic batteries, he and Juliet took a 6-week vacation round Holland, looking at medieval dungeons, Renaissance churches, quaint houses, and a large number of antique dealers' stores. Occurring simultaneously with this final race to perfection, the dance with a possible publisher had begun. Feeling that he had a blockbuster on his hands, and knowing too that recent technological advances had made the printing of books much cheaper, meaning you could sell many more copies, Hugo demanded a then record sum of 250,000 francs plus 50,000 for the translation rights. Albert Lacroix, a Belgian publisher, also suspecting Les Mis' enormous popularity, agreed to the terms without having a cent of cash on hand. As Hugo progressed with the final polishing, the amount of recopying became so great that Juliet needed additional help, they turning to his wife Adele's sister, Julie, to pitch in as well. As soon as Hugo revised a page, he gave it to the two copyists, who then rendered a final, neat copy. Hugo would then send the pages that were finished to the ferry going to the mainland, and these pages would then head to the publisher to be typeset, after which a print made from this had to be sent back to Hugo to be proofed. The winter's bad weather, fog and dangerous tides around the island, which randomly could delay ferry departures for days on week on end, made everything more complicated the process. Lacroix in Brussels also had to contact translators and printers in other countries and get copyright protections for the foreign language versions. And then Hugo needed to sign these foreign contracts, get the local Guernsey judge to authenticate his signature, then send them back to Lacroix for full-scale production of the book. If, as Lacroix repeatedly mentioned, Hugo and his two copyists, Julie and Juliet, had temporarily relocated to Brussels, Lacroix even renting a house for them in the hope they would, it would all have made everything much easier and quicker. But Hugo insisted on remaining in Guernsey. Lacroix later confessed that the process was sheer hell. But once completed, the results were pure heaven. And after Hugo's lover Juliet had done her part as an extraordinary copyist, now came the turn of his wife Adele, who went to Brussels to orchestrate the ad campaign and the final release. What can't the love of two women accomplish? We should all be so lucky. Adele's job was A, to stimulate heightened interest, but B, not to let any premature leaks occur. And apparently only one small one did in Brussels. Released on April 2nd, 1862, the first printing of 6,000 copies sold out in less than a day, garnering 72,000 francs in sales. And successive printings, after only another month, sold another 48,000 copies, and thus, at the same price, grossed almost 600,000 francs. So it turned out that both Hugo and his publisher were right as to its popularity. It has never been out of print since. To celebrate, the Hugos in September invited 80 friends, acquaintances, and those who had participated in the success to a massive dinner, starting at 6 in the evening and lasting until dawn. It featured a 17-course meal with delicacies such as duck with olives, songbirds wrapped in bacon, and partridge stuffed with truffles. In conclusion, for anyone who loves Hugo, Les Mis, romantic fiction, and the history of 19th century France, this book adds very welcome context. I'd give it an A. There really only being a few relatively minor weaknesses. Let's review the biggest. Bellos misunderstands economics and the nature of the Industrial Revolution as it occurred in Britain, France, and elsewhere. And thus, he misunderstands Hugo's emphasis on poverty, the nature of that poverty, whose fault it was, and of the social role Hugo played during this period. Imagine if the United States, which now has about 340 million people, increased its productivity enormously, and as a result tripled in size by 2126 to 1 trillion people. Do you think perhaps there might be a few problems, like insufficient housing accommodations or healthcare, and other unexpected difficulties? And what would those extra 680 million people, if you asked them, say? Wouldn't they be happy to be alive nonetheless, despite the problems? Similarly, because of the increased productivity and decreased infant mortality of Britain from 1750 onwards, the population of England went in 1 century from 6 million to 18 million. Of course they were poor people. There was an extra 12 million people. But without the Industrial Revolution and the accompanying decrease in infant mortality, those people never would have existed. So which is better, to exist and be poor, or never to exist at all? Not only that, but what happened as the Industrial Revolution progressed through the 19th century was, did it keep those people poor? No, it raised living standards for those extra 12 million British people enormously. And in the next half century until 1900, added another 14 million for a total of 32 million people. From 6 million in 1750 to 32 million in 1900, with the average standard of living, by some estimates, increasing from £1,600 per person to over £4,000. That was what the Industrial Revolution did for poor people, increase average income per capita by 2.5 times, while quintupling Britain's population in 150 years. And it's precisely these basic economic facts and their interpretation that consistently elude Bellos. So when he says in the 19th century that in society there was an ever more visible gap between needs and resources, that wasn't true in most cases, since living standards, despite the great increase in population, were rising. And when it was true for a period of time, it was because there were so many more poor people. So when he criticizes Hugo's portrayal of Jean Valjean's beneficial role as an industrialist, saying, this apologia for industrialism is a sentimental fantasy, even a sinister one for some modern readers, he fails to point out how valuable industrialism was. Similarly, when he says Jean Valjean's model factory and the philanthropic munificence that its profits allow suggests there's nothing wrong with exploitation, that's straight from the brain-dead Marxian playbook. There was no exploitation in general. He also complains that poor people still exist nowadays, which by any absolute 19th century standard is utterly false. Just about everyone today, poor or rich, lives better than the average person in the 19th century, as life expectancy and many other measures shows. On the other hand, he doesn't recognize the malign role of government in sometimes making the situation worse. The main abuses of English children came when they were orphans, under the control of the state in the form of the local parish, which then sent them to governmentally regulated workhouses, which Dickens described in Oliver Twist. So this part, too, Bellos gets wrong. Happy that, contrary to what Bellos says in claiming that France at Waterloo was the most advanced civilization in the world, my England was 2 to 4 decades ahead of France, industrially and technologically, and in many other ways, such as in abolishing slavery. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.